All right, so in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the different phases of kind of the stock market cycle and the business cycle and kind of how they connect. And again, kind of keep in mind that some of this terminology is more common and more typically used. Others I'm adding in here just for the sake of convenience for my own series of videos here. So for instance, when I refer to phase one, phase two, phase three, those aren't necessarily things that you would see used in other contexts, other articles or things like that. But if you start looking at contraction or expansion or the trough or peak or things like that, those would be much more commonly available in different sources discussing business cycles or the economy and things like that. So basically, from the trough to the peak is going to be the expansion period when the economy is growing. From the peak to the trough is going to be contraction. Okay, and generally, and I discussed this in a prior video, expansion tends to be significantly longer than the contraction. Okay, now I'm going to add some phases in here because it'll help with discussing the characteristics of some different stocks. So I'm going to call phase one this general region here, which is typically sort of the late contraction in terms of GDP. So the economy is still shrinking here, but it's kind of late in that shrinking process. Phase two, I'm going to use that is that bottom of the economy. So we're hitting the trough of GDP. At this point, the stock market would have already hit a bottom somewhere previous to that, probably more like a phase one kind of a thing. Phase three is going to be that expansion period. And then phase four is going to be the peak in GDP. Phase five is going to be early on in the contraction. So the contraction is going to be sort of broken up into the phase five early on versus late for the contraction. Okay. Now, again, keep in mind that just because I have these phases labeled on here doesn't mean, for instance, that when I transition into phase two, whatever companies that do well in phase one are automatically doing poorly. Or similarly, just because I transition to phase three, that automatically, whatever is doing well in phase two is going to do poorly. But the idea is that there are going to be certain companies that tend to thrive more, and their goods and services and whatnot tend to be more in demand in certain phases than in others. And the phases do kind of overlap. So if I'm looking at companies that do well, starting off in that trough environment when the economy starts to recover, they'll often do well in phase three as well, for instance. But they may start to taper eventually, particularly as you kind of progress towards the end of phase three, for instance. Okay, so that's kind of the idea. These are just sort of points to kind of help with the discussion when I talk about these phases here. But again, those phase labels are not standardized across business by any stretch that I'm aware of. But I use them in order to kind of help indicate kind of where we are in different points in time and what kind of companies and things would do well in the different environments. So really focusing more on like the late contraction or trough or expansion or peak or early contraction, those kind of terms would be more recognized generally, typically. All right, hopefully this little introductory video has been helpful. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.